my pay was going to be, because it was kind of a tricky situation because I still work in my facility. So I wasn't willing to give up my salary to go work at a different building within the company. So we had to go back and forth, and I requested this amount of money and they pushed it back. And we finally came to like a neutral medium, like where they would pay for my travel expenses and my hotel fees and all that kind of, all that. That wasn't originally included, but we were able to negotiate that so that I could go within the week, because at first it was going to be on a Saturday. And I was like, oh, wait, if I'm going to go on a Saturday, it needs to be more. So then we negotiated. Yeah, they were going to push back. They're not going to say yes at first. But it's okay to shoot for a huge number because they can only tell you no.
Exactly. So it is
That's what I would do.
And the negotiation, that's a skill all in itself, that takes time to develop. When I started my project, my big project, they asked me what the budget would be for a project like that. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, this is not usually how research budgets happen. Usually it starts with a grant, say, here's $300,000 for projects kind of like this. If you want this money, come up with a project proposal and a budget, and we'll either accept it or reject it. And so usually there's a pot first that you budget out the pot, not the other way around where they say, well, we don't have any money, but how much would it cost to do something like this? And that's what they asked me to do. So I came up with 3 different budgets. I had like the platinum level budget for like $125,000, and then the platinum gold level budget for $75,000, and then a silver and a bronze at the bottom for like $25,000. And they all had different levels of services in it. So in this one, you're going to pay for a grad student. In this one, you're going to pay for a statistician. In this budget, you're going to pay for this. And this one, you're going to pay for my travel to conferences and all of this stuff. And so they picked the one they liked, and they picked the $75,000 budget, and they said, we could do that. And I was like, oh, okay. So wait, what just happened? Type of a thing. So you do have to negotiate, and you have to identify what those items are from the get-go. So you have to really think about what it is that you need to do the job that they want you to do, or the job that you are telling them you can do. Nice. Finally, the buzzing went away. All right. Budgets. Totally off topic. I mean, not really off topic, but good segue there. Okay. So back to the MOAs. None of you guys will probably have a budget in what you're doing, but normally you would include that. Any other questions about MOAs? I look forward to seeing everybody. And I will try to get you guys feedback by next Tuesday at the latest, so a week to turn around everybody's MOAs.
If I wanted to get something from my client, like a little Visa gift card or something for helping me out, is that something I need to put on the MOA? You think? Because that wouldn't be part of the budget that she's paying me.
So this is just like a thank you for giving me access to everything. No, that wouldn't go in.
Okay.
Remind me of what you're doing again.
Evaluation of Lakeshore sports program.
Oh.
Yeah. It's something I'll do at the end.
Yeah, and you know these people too, so you have like a different relationship with them. Right. That wouldn't be weird. I think maybe in a situation where you don't already know the people really, really well, and that might be weird.
Sure. Yeah,
but in this one, no.
Okay.
Let me pay you for letting me do a job for you. All right. So today, clinical practice guidelines. I don't really have a PowerPoint. Well, I had a PowerPoint. It has like 3 slides on it, so I'm not going to pull it up. So today is really just going to be a discussion day, and I really hope that you guys are willing to engage in this discussion, because I don't want to lecture today at all. Elizabeth and I were doing some adaptive sports this morning. It was awesome, but I was treading water for an hour, which was super duper fun, but now I'm like wiped out. And I have like maxed out all of my activity indicators on my Apple Watch, so I'm like ready to go to sleep. So I don't want to have to be the only one contributing to our discussion today. So if everybody can share and pipe up. You guys had some really good questions on the discussion boards, which I did not print out, but I made mental notes of the ones of good questions. So please bring them up and such. But let's just have a nice little discussion here. What are clinical practice guidelines? What are they for? Well, what are they and what do they do?
They make sure that when we're practicing, it's uniform among practitioners.
Okay.
So everyone's kind of on the same wavelength, so to speak.
Yes. Uniformity. Also, I'm going to side note here. I feel like I've talked about this already this semester. Have we talked about this in this class, or is it our other class? Tara and Sandy and Jasmine, did we talk about this in 8710 yet?
I don't know.
I'm having weird deja vu with today's topic. But you guys are looking at me like I'm crazy, so maybe we haven't talked about it, and I'm just blending classes together. So, okay, new topic for today. Practice guidelines. So yes, a systematic way of doing something, our practice, right? Are they broad guidelines just for anything in rec therapy practice, or are they specific to anything?
I think they're fairly broad. I mean, it's geared towards recreation therapy, but you mean specific places where we would practice?
Not places.
Oh, people, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So do you guys know of any clinical practice guidelines in rec therapy? Yeah. So we have the dementia practice guidelines. We've all heard of the DPG, right? Dementia practice guidelines. Right now, they are the only clinical practice guidelines in all of rec therapy. But do rec therapists work with more than just people with dementia? What do we think about this? It needs to change. Why? Oh, guys, it's going to be a rough night.
Because we should be acknowledged as an actual therapy and not just some, random beach ball thrower. Like, we really need to work on improving our actual, processes and what we do so that people look at us as more than that, and that we actually are clinicians and that we have things to contribute and goals that we work toward. And as therapists, I think we have traditionally just let other people do that for us, and we have not stepped up as a profession to try to establish guidelines that would be uniform across the board, instead of just relying on other disciplines to do that.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I have some opinions as to why we don't have practice guidelines for all of the kind of populations that we work with, but I mean, do we use other professions' practice guidelines? I don't know that we do, because if they're specific to rec therapy, if our dementia practice guidelines are specific to rec therapy, and let's say other, like OT or whatever, has clinical practice guidelines specific to populations, they're going to be in that frame of occupational therapy, which is way outside of our scope of practice, right? So we probably shouldn't be using their practice guidelines, because their practice, the scope of their practice is different than the scope of our practice, right? So
if we were using their guidelines, then why wouldn't we just be occupational therapists too?
good question, good point. And maybe this is what contributes to that weird overlap between OT and RT. Specifically, I think there's more overlap there than with PT and RT, but we don't have any practice guidelines. So really, what is guiding our practice? What do you guys think?
We can see each individual in her own.
Yeah. I'm totally blending classes together. We talk about this, I think, in 8710. You guys have already taken it, so you should know. Where do we get our sources of knowledge from? How do we know what we know when it comes to practicing in rec therapy?
From tradition, what's always been done.
We do what's always been done. This is how my supervisor does it, and so this is how we do it.
We have a few models that we can go by.
Okay.
So how many people actually use those models? I mean, you could ask a practitioner about them, and they probably have no clue.
It's true. It's not standardized, or we're not held to anything. We use the models.
Yeah, I mean, maybe leisure ability model, but other than that.
Right.
Okay, so for all of our practitioners and former practitioners, or soon to be practitioners, how many of you use some type of practice model in practice in your facility? A rec therapy specific practice model. You did?
Yeah, very much.
Where was this?
I was at the VA in Indianapolis,
And what did you use and how?
the leisure ability model. So we had some like more structured, like activity, like interventions, and then we had those were like the education, and then we had leisure participation.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the last one?
Leisure participation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well, we
functional
have, like,
treatments, functional interventions, leisure education in the middle, and then participation, just rec participation at the end.
we had like different intervention types kind of based on those three. Makes sense.
Yeah. So every activity you did, every intervention you did fell somewhere in one of those three.
Right.
So there are some guidelines to your practice by using a model, but is that model specific to a population? No. Exactly. So good to have a model to guide practice, but even better to then have like the next level of specificity in that guidance to have clinical practice guidelines. So does anybody really know the dementia practice guidelines? Have you ever used them? Anyone? Okay, well that's going to be in the other half of our discussion today. But I don't know what they say either because I've never read them, and I don't even know. Actually, I was talking to Marika about this recently, that she doesn't think they're in print anymore.
I didn't even know they existed. Like I know like stuff, like I actually do programming for dementia for like 11 years, and I didn't even know they existed. And I feel really jacked up that I didn't know.
Well, dang.
I have a certification in it. Do you have that, Shelley? That certification? Certified dementia practitioner? They don't. With that certification, they don't have the guidelines or anything like that.
Where did you get the certified dementia practitioner?
That it was separate from anything rec therapy. So it was National Council Dementia Practitioners or something like that.
Okay,
I
so
did look into that, but it was really expensive, and I was like, well, I'd rather just go back to school. So.
Don't do it. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
It's not
I
worth
was like, no. So
You made
yeah.
a great choice.
What state do you live in?
Massachusetts.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm in Alabama. We're always behind. So we're like, all of us are trying to like, hey, catch up. Like, listen to us. We know what we're talking about. We're not idiots.
I was very disappointed when I took the class. It's only an 8-hour class, and it's very regimented what you're shown. So there isn't really a lot of wiggle room. And I actually went to get certified to be an instructor, and you can't, like, they have slides that you have to use. They have this information that you're required to show, and then that's it. Like, you can't go kind of off the script, so to speak, with different, sharing different things that you found work and everything else. So I just feel like it's really controlled, and there isn't really the proper training for the trainers that are doing the certification, like offering it. So I'm not impressed by it.
So then the thought with the certified dementia practitioner is that you get this extra certification, and it means you have extra knowledge about the population?
Knowledge about the population, interventions.
But does it tell you this is how you work with somebody with dementia?
Yes.
These are the best practices in that 8-hour course. These are the best practices to use with somebody with dementia.
Sure, it's not based on evidence. There's no evidence-based practice that they reference or anything either. It's just like, hey, you should do this, this, and this. Keep this in mind.
Yeah, okay. So we have models that help guide our practice. In some ways, we have these extra certifications. So the certified dementia practitioner element is like not specific to rec therapy, broader healthcare industry type of a thing.
Yep.
Within rec therapy, we do have specialty certificates, right? We have I'm going to totally butcher them. I think
Geriatrics.
a geriatrics one. It's not called dementia, it's just geriatrics.
It's geriatrics.
We have a PM&R one, physical health one.
I think there's a community.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are similar to what a certified dementia practitioner does, but it's specific. It's your specialization in rec therapy. So let's say you're going to work with veterans. I don't think there's a veteran specialty, but if there was one and you knew forever you were going to be working with veterans, you could go and get this extra training, pay the extra money to get the specialization. And then if I'm hiring people, I would look at Katie Walker's resume and say, oh, she has a specialty in veterans healthcare, whatever, specific to rec therapy. So she must know how to do all this extra stuff, right? So that provides a little bit extra guidelines in our practice too. But the top-notch level of practice guidelines are clinical practice guidelines, right? This systematically gathered kind of pool of evidence about how to work with a very specific population. So the dementia practice guidelines, specific to rec therapy, how did those come to be? Does anybody know? No, you didn't even know about them, so you didn't know. Linda Buettner wrote them, and she is a rec therapy educator, although she passed away a number of years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago. She spent her whole life working with patients with dementia, and she started to compile the evidence out there, right? So what Tara was saying, none of the recommendations that they gave you for the CDP were evidence-based, but clinical practice guidelines are evidence-based. So the whole point is that we scour the literature with our very critical eye, right? Choosing the best literature out there, the best studies that say this is how you work, or this is the outcome of this type of intervention with somebody with dementia. And you get all of that together, and then from there you make recommendations. So the entirety of the literature says that these are the best things that you can do with this population to affect these changes. Increased quality of life, decreased functional deficits, whatever. So that now if I want to work with somebody with dementia, or if I'm working in a long-term care center or whatever, and they happen to own a copy of the dementia practice guidelines and I'm the rec therapist, I would think for sure that I would pull those out, read through there, and maybe they're saying ropes courses and, high ropes and low ropes are the best things you can do with people with dementia. Okay, random. Okay, obviously not, but okay. But if that's what it says, well, dang it, that's probably what I should be doing, right? But what are we doing instead? Playing bingo. No, I'm just being, sarcastic here, right? But so it kind of boggles my mind that we don't have practice guidelines for any other population that we work with. What do you guys think about that? You should be getting heated right now.
Let's do it.
Should we develop some? Okay, so Linda Buettner spent her whole career developing the dementia practice guidelines. So I know that might be a little bit outside the scope of our ability at this stage. Okay, so good point. ATRA used to, ATRA, our organization, used to have a task force to develop practice guidelines, clinical practice guidelines for a variety of populations that we work with. So dementia already is developed and in existence, although apparently rarely used, and maybe not in print anymore from the last conversation that I had. There are practice guidelines as of a couple of years ago in development for obesity. And then hang on, I'm spacing where stroke is in the work. Like the planning is happening, but it hasn't gone anywhere. Currently, the task force for ATRA that develops clinical practice guidelines is dysfunctional and not in, I don't know, they were disbanded last year or something like that. I'm not really sure. I was just chit-chatting with Marika about that today. She said while she's president, she's going to re-up the task force. But I don't know. What are your guys' thoughts about all of this? How easy do you really think it is to scour the literature to find everything that there possibly is, evaluate the quality of everything that has ever been done?
So does ATRA not do their certification training in recreation therapy dementia guidelines anymore, and their advanced geriatric trainings? Do they not do that anymore?
I've never heard of those. Is that on the website?
No, it was like, I've been in this a little long. So but they used to do it, years ago. They used to have all these trainings, and kind of got away from, not by choice, but from ATRA just because school and stuff. So I haven't been as active, but they used to do all those trainings. They used to have all these, they used to, like, when you met at the conference, they'd have these certifications in those trainings. And just.
So I don't think they do that.
Contact.
Yeah, I don't think they do that anymore because I believe they moved to the specializations. So specializations started in like 2010-ish. And so they're really new.
It's been a while since I've been.
What's that?
It's been a while since I've been, so it would have been prior to all that. I mean,
Yeah,
it
so
would have been prior to 2000.
I think they stopped doing things like that where you can get these kind of one-off specializations at a conference or certifications at a conference and try to consolidate everything into like this more official specialty certification in these topic areas. I think there's 5. Somebody look it up on NCTRC really quick. Yeah, what, did you look it up?
No.
Oh, yeah, look it up really quick, Katie. And so they roll on the same 5-year cycle.
Open right now.
They roll on the same five-year cycle as what your regular certification does. So you get your certification and then you do whatever it takes to get the specialty certification, and then it's the same 5-year. You got to get extra CEUs. So this is where it's difficult to maintain. Like Whitney, I see you made that comment, and Shelly, that it's difficult to get it and it's difficult to maintain it because you have to get your regular CEUs to maintain your certification. Then you have to get extra CEUs to maintain the specialty certification. But nowhere in there having that specialty certification, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't say this is how you do this practice with this population. It's not as structured as the clinical practice guidelines.
Jasmine, are they always population-centered guidelines?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yep, it's not intervention-based, it's population-based. This is how you work, this is how you do rec therapy with, I wish I had a copy of the dementia practice guidelines because then we could look it up and see, like, do they break, rec therapy into certain categories of activity? So I don't
Tara
know.
put it in the chat. I think Tara just put the link in the chat. You can roll it up if you want to pull
It's
it up.
I think it's just an article about it because the guidelines is an actual book, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, but it has information about it.
Oh yeah. Everybody click on that up there in the chat. Intervention guidelines. Okay, the ATRA dementia practice guidelines provide recreational therapists, I'm on page 2, and others, with okay, that's a side note for discussion later, with consistent framework to follow for assessment, prescription, treatment, and outcome measurement for older adults with dementia and disturbing behaviors. This document includes valid and reliable assessment tools, 82 rec therapy protocols, holy cow, and the most current evidence supporting those interventions. The guideline also supplies the same physician orders for the recreational therapies as well as an extensive reference list. 82 protocols. So obviously those protocols aren't in here, but she had to develop those protocols too. So imagine if you, again, were practicing in long-term care or with this population, wherever, and you said, I want to start doing rec therapy, and you're talking to your clinical director and a doctor or whoever, and they say, well, what kind of activities would you do? Let's pull out the dementia practice guidelines, and here's 82 evidence-based protocols that I could do to achieve these specific outcomes, and here are the assessments that I would use to measure those outcomes. Angels singing, clouds parting, rays of light coming down, rainbows and birds chirping, right? I mean, that makes your job real easy. How many of you have found yourself in a situation where you've been given a new client or whatever, and you're like, what am I going to do with this person, whether on an internship or whatever, and you're struggling to come up with what activity you're going to do with them, and you've talked to them and they don't have any input yet because maybe they're, like Natalie, I'm thinking of like people in psych who are not always there willingly, so if you had some type of guidelines or notebook of awesomeness stuff that says, this is what you can do with somebody with this diagnosis who's probably going to be in acute care, whatever. You have this amount of time, do this for this outcome. Makes your life real easy. It would be helpful.
Is there a movement towards trying to do something like this for populations? And so, I mean, I haven't really heard of this. I mean, none of us knew about it, about like the one example we have.
There's the ATRA task force, but they're not functioning right now. I don't know why. Marika just kind of laughed and said, it's just dysfunctional. So I don't know the reason why, but this seems like a vital element to our practice, right?
So I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Because, and I'm going to ask for input from other people as well. I've been working in the field for 10 years, and I work with PTs and OTs, speech pathologists, pulmonary specialists all the time, and I don't hear any of them mention this either. And so I wonder if they have it as well, if they have standards of practice or guidelines for practice that they're using. I mean, I think historically we just go to evidence-based practice that we know works with certain populations, and we tailor things as needed. So I don't know like how we would implement that with our current culture in rec therapy.
So that's a really good point. I'm not sure if like PT and OT and speech or whatever have developed practice guidelines based on population. So, and the difference here between having some cohesive type of a book, this is how you practice with people with dementia, as opposed to just, I'm going to run and look up real quick on Google Scholar and see what the most recent couple of articles says about doing this intervention with this population. I think that's probably how a lot of people function. If they use research at all to guide the selection of interventions, that might be how, well, that is how they do it because there are no practice guidelines, right? Okay. So if somebody is on top of it enough to be able to think to turn to the literature first before they develop the program, they just go and do that. That is how it works. And maybe that's what PT and OT and whoever else does. They just run to the literature real quick, see what to do. They find one or two articles that say this is how things have been done in the past, and here's some outcomes that you could achieve, and you say, okay, I'm going to try that. The difference being with practice guidelines is that they have reviewed it all, selected the best of the best, the most rigorous studies, right? So what's the gold standard of a scientific study? Derek, I think you asked this question in your, what's the gold standard?
Yeah.
What's the gold standard in terms of like a study design? Randomized controlled trials, right? So double blind, control group, experiment group. So your participants don't know if they're in the control or the experiment group. The researchers themselves don't know if they're in the control group or the experiment group. Everybody, you guys watch Grey's Anatomy? Remember way in the early years when Meredith or Derek was doing his brain study or whatever, and Meredith messed it up and got somebody she found out somebody was in the control group not getting the treatment, and she pulled some strings and the whole thing got shut down. Yeah, so he was doing a randomized controlled trial. That is the top of the line, the gold standard for producing knowledge so if we can find a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials in rec therapy and review what the results are specific to one population and potentially one intervention, that would be some pretty strong evidence for doing this with this group of people, right? Do we have anything like that?
Well, don't we have, I know that in other classes that we've talked about with our approach to research, that a lot of times we can't like withhold treatment from people because ethically that's not okay. So how, I don't see that being a realistic.
So depending on what we're doing with our intervention, there are ways to delay treatment.
Well, yeah, I know that you've talked, I think it was you or Dr. was talking about where basically there was such a long wait list to get into a program that you do like data collection there, which is the like not getting treatment group, but then they eventually do get it.
Exactly. So you can do delayed treatment control groups where maybe they were on a wait list, or maybe you intentionally put them in this control group. And then let's say, so Marika she's done a couple of controlled trials with yoga. And so what she did was delayed treatment. So she had a ton of people and she put some in a control group, some in the experiment group, did her 8 or 12-week yoga sessions or yoga program. And then at the end of that, she did another 8 or 12-week yoga program and had the people who were the control group were now getting the intervention. And so their data was able to contribute as well as experiment data. So they got the intervention, because it's not ethically right to withhold treatment. And if you are like, this is going to cure this or fix this or improve this, how moral is it to say, sorry, you randomly got put in the group that doesn't get it. Better luck next time, right? No.
My mom's actually in a study right now for decreasing migraines, and they have like 3 different treatments, one of which is placebo, and she's not going to get a delayed treatment.
She's in the placebo group?
Oh, she doesn't know.
Oh. Well.
But they said it's like a year, and she's getting paid, which is kind of cool, but she's not getting any kind of delayed treatment. Like, she's not going to get the real thing after.
But if she doesn't know if she's in the control group or not, how would she know?
No, meaning like after the year of the study, regardless of it, which group she was in, she's not getting any of the product. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Is that the same thing?
Oh.
I mean, they told her before she started.
Wait, it's a study for migraine medication?
Yeah. Like.
So she could either get the sugar pill?
Yeah.
Or.
She could either get a pill that's been used, a new one, or the placebo.
Okay, and she won't know what she's going to get. And then at the end of the study, you're saying that, let's say that new pill is like, oh my gosh, this fixes migraines instantaneously. They won't just give her. Right. That's what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah, that's not the same as like delayed treatment or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so for like FDA trials.
Yeah.
They didn't have to.
Sorry. Yeah. Delayed treatment would be if she were in the control group and got the placebo pill, and after a year, they then gave her one of the other.
So since she's not getting it, is that like you brought up that it's not ethical to not for the RT?
Okay, so there are maybe different levels of opinion or different opinions on when it's what's ethical to withhold from people. So drug studies, drug trials are different, I think, because I don't know, let's maybe compare, so migraines I'm sure are horrible, I've never had one, but let's maybe compare like cancer drugs. These are like life-saving drugs, right? And then let's compare yoga for Parkinson's disease. I'm sure, I know, based on my work with Marika, that it does make a difference in people's lives. But is it like life-threatening, life-sustaining? Is that the word? Cancer drugs are life-sustaining drugs? They are. So if you were going to withhold a treatment, we are going off on a tangent, but that's okay. If you're going to withhold a treatment or a intervention, ethically, which one would be worse to withhold? Probably the life-sustaining drugs.
I feel like that happens all the time.
What if those drugs don't work, though? You don't want to be like, oh, here, control group, here you go. We did our 6-month study about our migraine drugs, and we know that they don't fix your migraines and they make you crazy. And so here you go for your delayed treatment, experiment. I I don't know. I think different industries, different professions kind of have different takes on the ethical issues with delaying treatment. The point being to this whole conversation is that randomized controlled trials are the top of the line in terms of the scientific design, scientific study. We don't do a lot of those in practice, in rec therapy, partially because of the withholding treatment, but there are ways to get around that. But partially, probably the bigger issue, right, is that it's because how do you control that if a lot of our research is done in practice? How do you assign somebody in a long-term care center to a control group or a experiment group? So you get rec therapy and you don't. But if there are policies within the organization that say everybody has to have rec therapy, how do you say that some people don't get it? And even if you incorporate like a delayed treatment element into that, I think what it does is just kind of messes up the flow of what they do in practice. And we've talked about that to some degree in this class, with being, as a consultant, being a disruption to the daily life in the facilities, right? And so I think this is part of the reason why studies like that don't happen in practice, because they are not easy. You have to tightly control all those elements, and in practice that's just really hard to do, which is why a lot of medical research and such happens in labs, where we can control the environment, we can control the subjects, whether they're rats or people or whatever, right? We don't often get to have labs where we can control all of that in rec therapy, which is why that type of research doesn't happen, which is why we don't have a ton of it, which is why we can't gather it. My flow of logic here. Okay, we can't gather it to then review it and critique it and then make recommendations towards practice based off of it. It's like this torturous circle, right? We need this research so that we can make these practice guidelines, so that we can practice better, so that we could study the outcomes, so that we could produce the knowledge to then guide our practice, which is based on the knowledge that we don't have because we can't. Okay, so it's like, oh my gosh, this is just this spiral of torture. Are we getting anywhere with this discussion? Are you guys just going to walk out of here and be like, well, we don't, it's too hard to do it. It's too hard to produce practice guidelines, so we just aren't going to. Sorry, I have these on my shirt, and I love playing with them. I have like 3 shirts with these little ties, and I like to do stuff with them all the time, so they're just here. What are your guys' thoughts about it? I'm going to read the commentary in the chat here.
Well, if you're doing like a specialized treatment research and like a long-term care research, I'm trying to think this through. Like, let's say you're doing something for mental illness, right? And you do a research group with just the mental illness and not with the rest of. Oh my gosh, Jake Cooper! Would that not be delay a treatment or excluding anybody because you're just doing a specialized thing away from every other population? Am I making sense? So that you can still do your research? Because you're not saying, Mrs. Jones, who has dementia, is going to be in this research here at this long-term care facility because she doesn't have a mental illness. Does that make sense? You're doing something different with her than you're doing with somebody else. Am I making sense? And why wouldn't that work?
To be totally honest, I was distracted by your dogs.
I am so sorry.
It's okay. Can you just start over?
So, like, because you had talked about, how we don't do research in the settings, right? So why couldn't we, if we have specialized programming, specialized research for just that one population? Because you're not going to take somebody with dementia and do a research project with them with the mental illness. So you're not delaying treatment or saying you can't do recreation therapy. You're just not in this group. Does that make sense? So you're still doing it in in the setting. Am I making any sense? Somebody help.
I'm trying to follow. I'm not sure that I followed. So
Because we don't have a lot of research, right?
yeah,
Because of the fact that we can't do it or we don't do it in
I mean,
in
we
our
can
study.
do it, but we just don't do it.
We just don't do it. We don't do it because we don't want to we don't want to leave anybody out. You know, everybody gets recreation therapy, right?
Okay.
So, but if you have a specialized research project that you're doing just on mental illnesses, why can't you just do that with your mental illness residents versus, you know, because you're not leaving anybody out, you're just doing it with this one group. Why
Yes.
don't we do that?
You can do that. That's a good question. Why don't we?
Because there's nothing wrong with that, right?
No. So think back to, there are some people in this class who are in 8710 right now, and we've been talking about this like every week for 5 weeks. Those of you who already took 8710 last year, we talked about this all the time. What does it take to be able to do research in practice? What knowledge? How many of you graduated with your undergrad feeling like you could do a study in practice? Raise your hand. No, I'm not saying I did. I'm just saying, raise your hand. I'm demonstrating how to raise your hand. Okay. So not very many people, because we are bachelor's level entry, right? Not very many people graduate out with the knowledge and skill of how to do those types of studies, Tracy. To put something together, a randomized controlled trial would be, I don't have that skill. I mean, that would push me to my limit in my knowledge of how to manage and put it all together. And so to expect somebody at the bachelor's level, you guys just came out of that level. Do you feel like you could go and do that in practice right now? So those of you who have been practicing for 10 years, plus years, whatever, do you feel like you could put together a high level study that could produce that type of knowledge? Maybe not even with the master's level degree. I mean, you're getting more research knowledge in Clemson's master's degree than probably anywhere else. Do you think you could walk out of here and put together a study? Everybody should say yes. Okay, maybe not a randomized controlled trial, but you know, so just disclaimer, we don't ever do that type of stuff by ourselves. I can guarantee you that Marika has MDs, PTs, OTs, all of them collaborating on those randomized controlled trials. She's not doing that alone. Okay, so that's not the expectation that you can put something together like that on your own, but we don't have the skill at the bachelor's level to do that type of research. I really wish I had a number on what percentage of all certified rec therapists are bachelor's level versus master's level practitioners. I would guess that probably more than 50% of our field is bachelor's level, right? So when we talk about what it takes to produce clinical practice guidelines, right? All of the knowledge, all of the research that has been generated about rec therapy practice specific to a particular population gathered together, who's producing that knowledge? Nobody. Who has the skill to produce that knowledge? A very small fraction, right? Most of it is coming out of faculty. Linda Buettner was a faculty member. Well, she was a practitioner too, but a faculty member for most of her career. All of her research was with dementia. So she had the skill and ability and the education level and the knowledge to go along with that to be able to produce that. But, you know, but that was her entire career worth of work. Maybe Marika will produce dementia practice, or not dementia practice, but practice guidelines specific to a particular population. She doesn't necessarily work with one population. She does more one intervention. Yoga with a billion different populations. I tend to be more in the veteran side of things, so maybe one day I'll pull up my bootstraps and put on my thinking hat and try to figure out how to create practice guidelines for veterans. I do have opinions about, based on my work experience and my research knowledge, about what works and doesn't work with veterans. Maybe I should just keep on, I don't know, what would I need to do? Generate a whole lot of research? You can't be the one to generate the research to then compile also the research. It has to be a lot of people contributing to that pot of knowledge before you can gather it together and then make recommendations out of it, because that's so much work for one person to do, right? It's like an impossible amount of work. Yes, it's impossible, everybody, right? For
Well,
one person.
one of the challenges for rec therapists with the research component as well is that we aren't viewed as a profession to conduct research. People want us in providing a service. They don't want to pay for rec therapists to do that other piece. I mean, even with a master's level or PhD level, they want the service provided. That's why you have the FTE. That's why you have someone employed, is to provide treatment or structure a program, or for whatever reason. The focus, I mean, so I can speak for the research in the facility where I work, because I work in a research hospital, is the focus is on biomedical research. And recreation therapy is there to support the protocols that patients are involved in, whether that is coping with being in the hospital or working on functional outcomes. I mean, we don't do any research, which is unfortunate because it's a unique facility where the majority of the staff have a master's level degree. It might not be in rec therapy, but they're master's educated, which is unlike any facility I've worked in before.
Mm-hmm.
There are people with great ideas and passion for this profession, but they just haven't had the opportunity.
Well, I can tell you that there are very, very, very few people with PhDs in rec therapy who practice with a PhD, because one, it's not required. Two, nobody's going to pay you what you would demand with that level of education, right? So I don't know what our entry level, hourly pay, $12 or $15 an hour. I would not take a job, if I was not in practice. If I was not a faculty member, I would be going for nothing less than a director position, and it would have to be a good, really high paying director position. Okay. But those are the types of positions where I could, as a PhD in rec therapy, influence the research agenda of a facility. So I'm totally going to use you at NIH. So Donna Gregory is the director of rec therapy at the National Institutes of Health, the hospital where Whitney works, and she is in our online PhD program. Everybody should be like, whoa. Okay, so when she graduates and now can write, PhD after her name, she potentially, I don't really know you're like shaking your head. And I know she and I have had some conversations about it, but let's just say pie in the sky, ideally, she could potentially get in on all of the research that's happening at NIH and start to include rec therapy in that research agenda, where before it's only been biomedical. Well, now there's this psychosocial side to it, biopsychosocial research, right? Man, NIH would be producing like this holistic perspective on treatment if they included that element in research. They probably won't.
She loves stats too. She spoke at a conference I spoke at this past year, like in this past spring, and we talked because she was cited on my lecture not my lecture, but my presentation or whatever. And hers was on statistics and that kind of thing and the importance of that. And she's really cool. So she's like awesome. If you can get like her name out, like she's going to be one of those people that's going to be like, ooh, let's see what these stats do to make things better for everybody. She's really great.
But she's a really good example though of how, there are very few jobs where a PhD in rec therapy would be useful. That would be one. A director of rec therapy at holy cow, can only even imagine. But to have that PhD behind your name, so which means you have the skills to do this, this, and this, which is all the research. If she wanted to, I don't know, Whitney, you might be able to weigh in on what her kind of focus area is. I only know based on my limited year and a half of knowing her in terms of camp and siblings camps, but
physical medicine rehab is really Donna's zone.
The broader. Yeah. So she and I are working on a project about camps for siblings of, they're called bereaved siblings. So siblings of kids with cancer who have died and such. And so they have camps for these kids so that they can come and be around other siblings of, people who have died and such. Imagine if that would be such a specific subset, but imagine if she decided to put together the practice guidelines for bereaved siblings, right? This is how you work in rec therapy with siblings of cancer patients. Cool, huh? There's not hardly any research out there in rec therapy about that. So she wouldn't have much to go on to develop practice guidelines. Boo, right? I don't know. So I guess the moral of this first half of our class discussion is practice guidelines are kind of vitally important. So say the articles that we read, yet we don't have any, except for dementia. And they're really, really difficult to produce. That doesn't sound very good, does it? All right, let's take a break. Yeah, like 10 minutes-ish. Come back at like 7:15. Okay, ready, pause.
What's your undergrad?
Hers was social work.
And master's is
Social work.
Oh, I'm walking to the end of the conversation. I'm butting myself in. I'm just curious.
Same. I do that and realize that I'm kind of rude sometimes. Yeah, no, like I'm just curious. I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? Oh wait, maybe it was a private conversation. Like, not anymore. Yeah.
All right, everybody, come on back. Okay, so let's just wrap up our discussion really quick on clinical practice guidelines with a quick discussion on why we think they're not used in practice. So let's say, for example, the dementia practice guidelines are out there, but we don't use them. Why?
I think because it's very, like, individualized. Like, I could be working with somebody who has dementia, but, like, you take into account their interests and their leisure, what they like to do, and, like, you'll design, like, intervention for them. But then, like, you'll work with somebody else who has dementia, but they could have completely different interests. So it wouldn't benefit them as much. It's, like, it could be kind of hard to follow those.
Okay, so because so I hear you're saying that there's a lot of like facility constraints in terms of needing to maximize our time and to do similar interventions with groups of patients maybe. And so because the dementia practice guidelines, for example, are so individualized, it would be difficult to apply that to a group.
Well,
Is that what I heard you
I was
say?
thinking kind of like, yeah, the other way around. Like, so people are.
I mean, I guess it's part of like evidence-based practice, like you use research, your own knowledge, and then like the patient's interest and like put them together.
Mhm.
What you're saying, like,
So you wouldn't use the guidelines because it's more individualized.
well, you could, but they just have to be.
Yeah, like they would have to be adapted anyways.
But there are 82.
That's true.
So you can find one good one.
There are 82. There's bound to be one in there.
So what about more kind of going along the lines of that thought process, but setting wise, you know, what if it's like a community-based gym, like where I interned, or like a mental hospital, but maybe, or sorry,
Psych.
anyway, psych hospital. Sorry.
A mental hospital. I like it.
But within the settings, you might be working with like the same population, but I guess I just need to see like kind of what her 82 things
I know.
are.
But, you know, our interventions aren't really specific to a setting, right?
Yeah.
You can do arts and crafts in a hospital just like you could in a community center. Adaptive sports happens in a community center in the same, to some degree, manner that it happens in a hospital, right? In fact, a hospital might pair with a community rec center to do adaptive sports because they don't have a gym or whatever. So I feel like those 82 protocols might be specific to the population, but they're not necessarily specific to where things have to happen. And so I hear what you're saying in terms of they're so individualized that there's not a whole lot of flexibility, but I think that there actually is flexibility built into it, that you can flex a little bit to address client needs or settings or whatever. So the point being that this is the starting point for how we practice with this population, We don't go outside of these boundaries, but you can go here, you can go here, as long as you're within these boundaries, right? So I don't think that practice guidelines are intended to be so restrictive that it's this or nothing else with a person with this diagnosis, and that's it.
I think I'm thinking like from like the rec therapist standpoint, like for why you wouldn't use the guidelines, like because you're like meeting the client's needs. I don't know if we're like seeing it backwards, but I mean that makes sense too. But like you're, I think
I am not following people tonight, and I am sorry.
like so if you're trying to it's more of like an explanation for why rec therapists wouldn't use guidelines with a specific population, because they're like trying to meet the needs of the like individual, and that can be hard to flex. Yeah. Protocol to fit that.
I think that the protocol though is like you have to do this with this population. I think it's generally, I think it's more broad than what we're picturing.
Yeah, I just don't know what it looks like.
Well, so the critique, and I don't either because nobody here has a copy of the dementia practice guidelines. So I was just looking through that, the link that Tara provided in that document to see if they had a list of any of what those 82, they don't, but not a comprehensive list. So
it seems a little bit like, although it would be really convenient and really overall efficient to use standards, practice and practice guidelines, it feels like more work on the front end, and that's where it's hard to like actually get started anyway. So if you like admit someone, you do what's the word? An assessment. You do an assessment, and you're at the point where you have an idea of what you want to do with them, and you're about to get started, and you're like, oh, but wait, I have to go back and find this other thing too. Then maybe like,
I think it's
I'm
supposed
just
to be
curious.
a baseline where you kind of start from.
Yeah.
You start from the practice guidelines. So one of the articles that we read this week was about comprehensive program design, right? So let's say you just got hired somewhere to start a rec therapy program for a particular population at this site, and there happen to be practice guidelines out there. Where would you get the resources to develop your program? From the practice guidelines. Yeah, which means there is no work after you establish it based on the practice guidelines. There isn't a lot of work. Okay, there's still work, but it's not like this front-loaded heavy, I got to find all these different activities that I could do with these people. It's already there for you, and it's already constructed. And so you might, again, going back to the having flexibility built into it, you might add some assessments here. They have, there's 82 protocols. Gosh, what was the number of assessments? I should just leave this document open. Keep closing it. Oh, I lost it. Where is it? Hang on. I scrolled through it. Okay, there it is. Framework to allow for this document includes valid and reliable assessment tools. Doesn't say how many. 82 RT protocols and the most current evidence supporting those interventions. Okay, so let's say there's 20 valid and reliable assessments established for this population that you're working with and 82 protocols. Well, those should be the assessments that you do. You could add to it if you wanted, but for sure those should be, as long as they address the outcomes that you're trying to address in the program, right? So we don't just randomly do assessments because they told us to do assessments. We pick and choose the ones that fit with the program that we're trying to do, with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with that population. Okay, so did that answer your question? Or did that help clarify thoughts. Okay, hold on. Gotta read Whitney's comment. I don't disagree with the premise of practice guidelines. The challenge I see is the amount of time it takes to develop these, and how are they modified or updated to remain current with evidence-based practice and best practice. Good.
I didn't want to interrupt you from your thought, but I wanted to make sure I didn't forget what I was going to ask.
No, really good. I mean, feel free to add or whatever to that, but really good point. It does take a really long time to do it. And this goes back to the issue at hand, that if we don't have the existing literature from which we then develop guidelines, how do we develop them? Because it has to be based on our rec therapy literature. We can't borrow from the PT literature on PM&R, which I'm sure they got some really great stuff, but it's not specific to rec therapy. Would it be supplementary knowledge? Absolutely. But we can't base our practice guidelines off of PT research, right? Because then they would be pre-PT practice guidelines. Okay, so yeah, I don't think that this is necessarily means that we shouldn't do it. This is just like the spiral of torture, right? That we have to have this literature base, this knowledge base from which to develop these guidelines, and it doesn't exist. So it's going to take a lot of time. So who produces that? If it's just left to the faculty, academic researchers to do it, it's going to take a really long time because there aren't very many of us. How many faculty members are there in comparison to practicing rec therapists? I don't really know how many faculty members there are out there in RT. I would say maybe 50 or 80, somewhere around there probably, educators spread out all across the country. Some in the younger generation like me, some in our older generation, who came from a whole different world. And so if it's left to just the 50 to 80 people who have the research knowledge to produce the research base, it's going to take a really, really long time because we all have different interest areas to do that. But if we can get our practitioners, the thousands of practitioners that are out there, to contribute to that knowledge base, then it could still take a long time, but maybe considerably less time. And somebody would just like maybe me, after we kind of feel like, hey, maybe there's like 20 people who like working with veterans and we all come together to form like the Veterans Practice Guideline Task Force for ATRA. Maybe we should come up with that. Right? And so we spend a year or two scouring the literature, collecting up everything we can to then come together and say, okay, this is what we found, now let's critique it. And then we can make those recommendations, those guidelines, but without that existing knowledge.
Well, and I like that thought process of like, how do you put it all together? Because you're looking at, if you're taking people who are currently working as educators, who are seasoned professionals, these are people who are working full-time jobs. Like, these are not people who have the excess time to gather this data. So who's going to pay them to work on this? Is ATRA going to have a fund available? Or, right. Like, who's going to fund it to better their profession? But someone has to step up and say, we're going to pay for this because it's important to us to be seen at this level of PT and OT, to really cement that we are a clinical profession and we provide therapy and that we're not just here taking things from other people, that we offer value of our own. And I think that's always been a big hurdle for rec therapy.
I mean, if ATRA would pay me to develop the practice guidelines for example, for veterans, they would have to buy out all of my teaching time. So I'm not teaching any classes anymore, and we hire adjuncts or we hire another faculty member or whatever, but that basically means ATRA is paying part of my salary. Because if I don't teach, Clemson's not going to pay my salary. Okay, so then somebody has to pay me that portion of my salary if it's ATRA, okay. But then it still gets back to the problem of the foundational knowledge doesn't exist. So then am I producing the foundational knowledge as a faculty member who's being paid by ATRA to develop the guidelines? So then I produce that foundational knowledge, and then at some point where we feel like we've hit a threshold of knowledge, I can gather it all together and say, this is how we practice. But that would be my lifetime of work. I don't know how Linda Buettner did it. So I don't know if she got funded by something with ATRA or if she, I don't know. I just saw, Sandy, your comment about practitioner database. I think it's a fantastic idea. So do you want to explain your idea?
Okay, so I don't know anything about databases, so we'll start there. But I think there are people in the world that do. And so it would be if we could create a database where we could separate our practitioner data from our research data and have practitioners in the field putting in to the database. So it's not taking away from your daily life. Maybe it's at the end of the day when you're writing your progress notes or whatever, or maybe you do it on a monthly cycle. But if the database was put in a way where, and maybe this is a task force to come up with the bullet points that we need on that database to collect what we need, our outcomes, what are you using, what models are you basing it on? It might give us more information on what everybody's doing too out there.
I would happily analyze an existing database of data, If something like that existed, for example, if there was this huge data set, all veterans data that was, all of it was using rec therapy to address PTSD symptomology, TBI symptomology, substance use. What are some other main issues? Sleep disorder, anxiety, depression. Those are probably some of the top outcomes that we're saying rec therapy addresses in the veteran population. And so if there was something, some systematic way, so it would have to be systematic, right? So anybody who wants to contribute to that database would then need to be collecting that data in a rigorous, systematic way, right? So they're not using like Bob's depression scale, they're using something more rigorous than that, the Beck Depression Inventory or the PHQ-9, both of which measure depression. Regardless, it has to be a validated instrument, right? And they're doing it in a systematic way. I keep using that word over and over again, but that just means that there's structure to it, and it's not this haphazard, well, I'm going to give it to you now, and then we'll give it to you again in a month, but then in 2 weeks I give it to you, because it's just going to work better to do it now. So we'll just do it now. Well, no, I needed it at a month interval, not at 2 weeks interval. Okay, so there's got to be a lot of structure around how that data from the practitioners, which remember, we should already be collecting some of that data because it's part of our assessment process, right? So if we can just get that back and have confidence that it's quality data, I would gladly analyze all of that for free. If I got paid, even better. Like if ATRA paid me, even better. But I would totally do that, right? Because then we would have a ton of data. Right now we have no data. And from that we could then say, that would produce potentially multiple studies out of that we could divide it out. So here's adaptive sports for veterans and how it addresses those or impacts those different outcomes. And here's what are some of the other activities, Katie, that you did with veterans while you were at the VA?
We did community reintegration.
Okay. Okay, so here's all the practitioners that contributed leisure ed, who use leisure ed, and here's what they contributed. I'm going to pull all that out and look at what leisure ed does for veterans with regards to those identified outcomes. But it would take a long time to build up that database. Sorry guys, I touched my computer and everything shut down. Start over, whoever just said that.
Is it possible to run like a pilot and see, like, hey, we're going to do this thing for a year and see how it works? We did one at work. So I have 30 park rangers, and we have drop-down menus. So they go and they say, okay, I did this program. at this time, talk to this many people about these things. And I wonder if we tried it out and just had those drop-down menus with something, scales or models, maybe that could be a start the conversation with what we want to collect, but kind of give people a visual and play with it a little bit, because I think it takes a little while, some tweaking to get the information we might want.
There would need to be some centralized way and place, because I wouldn't want to be hand entering data from practitioners, right? So how many of you guys do electronic data or assessment and documentation? 3. So everybody else is paper, pencil type of, well, we have some people not practicing. Internships where you guys went electronic or paper, pencil? Paper, pencil. And so then after you did your paper, pencil, maybe not for Lakeshore Foundation, but for the hospital, you probably went and hand entered something, progress notesy, right, online somewhere?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we just typed them up and then I mean, the like
killing trees to put it online to kill trees.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we didn't really submit it like anywhere else.
well, that's the thing. So this data, to some degree, is already being collected. It's just it's housed within its own facilities, right? And HIPAA protects a lot of that. But if we can de-identify that data, then it doesn't have to be protected as much. So then if we could somehow get a centralized place where all of this information could come and we could identify this intervention at this time or whatever. Yeah, I mean, if that's what I was going to do, if I was going to be the one to manage that database, I would want to be paid to do it so I could buy myself out of my teaching time and learn how to develop a database like that, because that's the thing. I don't think something like that already exists. It would have to be developed. Well, who's going to do that? Are you going to do it, Sandy?
Not if you want it to look good. No.
Well, and that's me at this point. Not if we want it to look good, right? I could like throw something together, right? A Google Doc, Excel sheet. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, so we would need something high quality. And so likely somebody's going to have to fund that. Now there might be some type of grant out there, I don't know where, that might be able to contribute some money to developing a database like this. I have no idea where that would exist and where to find that. But that would be the type of thing where I would apply for that and use that money to buy my time out to create that database, which then practitioners could contribute to. And then since I have the skill, I'll analyze that and write it up, and maybe I'll partner with a practitioner or two to get some publications off of it. I think that would be a fantastic idea. That's a much more efficient way to build that knowledge base, right? So if there's a lot of knowledge being produced, then it's not on one person to produce it, and it's not on one person to gather it and make recommendations off of it. Good idea, Sandy, good idea. Do not let that distract from your dissertation. Okay, so any other thoughts as to why we don't use practice guidelines, clinical practice guidelines in rec therapy? Besides the fact that they don't exist, let's just get past that. It's a big hurdle, but let's try to get past it. It's the warp wall. We're starting on the warp wall of ninja warriorness in rec therapy, as opposed to that first little easy side jump thingy. I'm being random.
I mean, I think the culture of the profession. I mean, you've got folks who came into this when it was activities, and then they had to redo kind of their education and get the TR classes and get certified. I mean, I know there's people that I work with who first got started when it was activities focused. And I think there would be some resistance to guidelines for practice, especially from folks who've been in the field for more than probably 15, 20 years.
Absolutely, because it will tighten down what they can do, right? And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because if we think back again to how do we know what we know? How do we practice the way that we practice? Why do we practice the way that we practice? So much of that is based on just tradition of this is how it's always been done with this population in this facility. It's always been done this way, and we don't change that. So I know many older generation rec therapists who never took the exam. They were grandfathered in. You know, they didn't take classes like what you're taking. They don't go to conferences, so they don't maintain. They do like the bare minimum to maintain their CEUs to maintain certification. And so I agree with you. I think that there's kind of a generational thing here where it might be really difficult to get people to change their ways and tighten up their practice. And instead of saying, well, I mean, in some ways the practice guidelines say this is what you do. Here's 82, and this is within the scope of your practice with this population. These are the 82 things that you can do. And some people might think, oh, so restrictive. 82. You got a lot of choice there, right? Does anybody do 82 different interventions? Our practitioners who are practicing on a daily basis, Shelly, Whitney, Tracy, Janelle. Janelle, are you practicing? Yeah. Okay. Do you guys do 82 different interventions? No. You probably have like what, a core, oh, sorry, Sandy and Jasmine. Dang, I forgot like half the class there in our practitioners. You probably have like a core of what, 15 maybe? Like solid interventions that you do? Yeah, so to say like, oh, practice guidelines are so restrictive, I think that's really kind of you don't have many legs to stand on there because you got a lot of options to choose from.
I think it would give us credibility too. Like that was my favorite thing I read about, like in all the articles, like it was talking about credibility and how guidelines give us credibility, because how can you go places and speak to a group of people and say, this is what I do and blah, 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 if you don't have everybody on the same page. So like, it's hard when you go to a group of people and you speak and you're like, especially if it's like a group of social workers or nurses or something, and then you're talking about being a rec therapist, and they're like, well, we have a rec therapist at our facility. Well, they don't do half the stuff that I know that we do at my facility. So the credibility is just not there if you don't have anything to like hold people to a certain standard. And it's unfair. It's completely unfair. I hate it.
This opens the whole discussion about the educational backgrounds of rec therapists and the variety of classes that everybody takes. I mean, really, we take the same 5 core classes, right? But beyond the 5 core classes that you need for certification, every university with RT is really kind of different, right? So our undergrads at Clemson get 10 RT classes. There's not very many other places where you get 10 RT classes. Only 5 are required for certification. And so that's what most places have. Okay, so what knowledge and skill are our undergrads coming out with that somebody from, I'm not going to name any places, but wherever else, came out with? So then they go into practice, and Shelly, you've got a Clemson grad coming in and a so-and-so grad coming in, and already their competency is like this, right? Or like this, or, maybe, I don't think it would be this close. I think it would be like, really divergent. And so, hang on, I just lost where this was going. Right, so the credibility of rec therapists based on competencies from the get-go. And if we then further down that road to credibility, if we don't have practice guidelines that standardize how we practice, regardless of what your educational background is, because at least with the 5 classes, that's the bare minimum, right? So if you walk in with 5 classes and then somebody hands you practice guidelines, you should be able to do it, right? If you walk in with 10 classes, even better. You should still be able to do it. But with the 5, you should be able to do it. But if we don't even have that, then it's variable on what you get, where you go. I agree with you 100%. The credibility is not there. So somebody asked, Whitney, I think you made this comment that do practice guidelines exist in like PTOT and in the medical world and stuff? Because you never hear anybody at your institution talk about it, which is crazy because it's NIH and you would think that they would. But I think the answer is yes, these are not specific to rec therapy. I went back during the break-in, was looking at some of the stuff in one of the articles. I can't remember which one. But it's from the Institute of Medicine, which is not rec therapy specific. That's like broad level organization for medical knowledge. And so this is a conversation that's happening in the medical field, not just in rec therapy. So it's weird to me that nobody uses those terms. And maybe you can like do some asking around at your, and I encourage everybody to do that, especially if you're working at a place that's interdisciplinary. Say, hey, do you guys have any, ask your PT, do you guys have any practice guidelines, like clinical practice guidelines? Use that phrase, clinical practice guidelines, and see what they say. I'd just be curious. Bring it up in class next week. Yeah.
Should bring it up in my department head meeting in the morning. And she'll be like, hi, everyone. Can we discuss this? Does anyone have clinical practice guidelines? And they'll probably laugh in my face. And then I'll laugh. Then it'll be great.
Wait, why do you think they would laugh in your face? Because they don't have them, or they would laugh in your face because they think, well, she's just the activities lady. How does she know how to ask about? Why do you think that they'll laugh at you?
They always laugh at me anyway, but they'll probably laugh because they won't have a clue. Because most of the time I sit in meetings and most of the people in the meetings on the interdisciplinary team talk down to me because they're like, I always have to fight for my profession. And so they'll be like, oh, you just play with beach balls. You're the beach ball champion and all this kind of stuff. And most of the time I have more college education than everyone at the table. So I always have to remind them about that. And I love it. I love reminding them about that. It's the highlight of my day. But yeah, they'll probably just laugh because they'll be like, excuse my language, but where in the hell did you come up with that? That's exactly what my boss would say.
Okay.
Yeah,
so I think you should do it, and maybe do it in a way where they won't laugh at you. So I don't know how you would ask that. I mean, but maybe
very serious.
Do they know you're doing a master's degree right now? Maybe bring it up and say, we've been talking about this in one of my classes, and I'm just curious, all you other departments here at so-and-so, what's the name of your place?
William F. Green State Veterans Home.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a big name, but there's a lot of disciplines there.
Yeah. So what are all the other disciplines?
We have a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, nursing. Of course, nursing is like the high power. Yeah. And then we have of course, social work. We have a psychologist on staff. We have a doctor on staff, nurse practitioners, stuff like that.
I bet you
the clinical people.
I bet you the nurses have practice guidelines, and maybe the social work peeps too. But yeah, and so Whitney, I see your comment there. I could totally want to know too what they say. So okay, intriguing. I can't wait to hear. Feel free to interject at any time, Whitney, if you get answers in the next 30-ish minutes about what's going on. But yeah, okay, so I think this is a good end of the discussion for clinical practice guidelines. We need them, we don't have them, we don't have the foundational knowledge to create them, and we don't have very many practitioners who have the skill to build that knowledge base, and it's very depressing to talk about practice guidelines in rec therapy, right? Would that be a sum up of what just we talked about for an hour and a half, 45 minutes? All right. Okay, so moving on to the last little piece of our discussion tonight is theory. So this was one of the articles, the other articles, the Caldwell article. You guys had some good comments about it. How do we use theory in practice? You don't necessarily have to spit back what Caldwell said to me. I want you to apply it like at a broader level, because she had a very specific kind of approach to what she was talking about. But just broad level, how do we use theory in practice? There are two people in this class who for sure should be able to talk about this, because we talked about it in class last week or the week before. Crickets. We have no ideas. All right, I'm totally going to call out Sandy and Jasmine. How do we use theory in practice, guys? How should we be using it? Do we think it's being used? Okay, Katie, you're shaking your head, so explain.
Why I think it's not being used?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a lot of people weren't educated on theories, or they don't remember them, or they aren't sure how to apply them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're sitting here silently, and we have more education than most of the field, so.
And have all of you guys taken advanced theory from Dr. Lewis? Have you guys taken advanced theory yet?
Oh, yeah, but we had it with.
Yeah, you guys had it with
Yeah.
Dr. Fragadakis?
Yeah.
And you can't talk about theory at all?
Well, I mean, in class when we talk about theories, you know, you can see how it can be applied, and we can think of examples and things like that. But then actually thinking about my own personal experiences, like my internship and stuff, it's just like you get the job done. Like you're there, you have your clients, you're working with them, and it may have been a part of like the production of the program and like the mission and the thoughts that went behind it, but on a day-to-day basis, it was just, I mean, and granted, I only have my internship. I don't have like experience in the field to be able to say what it looks like, but.
Okay.
So I guess, I mean, you can pick apart theory stuff, but it's more of in retrospect, not intentional.
It should be intentional, and it should be an active part of our programming.
Right.
Does it mean that every single day you're thinking, this is the theory I'm using and why I'm using it? No, definitely not. And it should be at the foundation of program development. You know, good research, if we're talking about the high quality research that goes into developing practice guidelines, is theoretically based. It's not just this random stuff off the random tree. And so if you're using theory as a foundation in program development and or practice guidelines, if they exist, then theory is infused already into what you're doing. It's impacting why you choose the activities that you do, what you choose, what activities that you choose or interventions, etc., how you interact with people, right? So what role then does theory take in practice? Anybody online?
I'll jump in. It helps us to make a case for what we're doing. So like you were saying with planning. And also I've been reading for the other class. I think I confused this class with that one as well.
I know, they are blending together.
A little bit. Yeah, the evidence table and reading articles. There, I think there's a lot of really good models in our profession that I think may even be way ahead of their time, that we should dig through and start really basing. We don't need to recreate the wheel. And I think when staff bring to me programs that they want to do, the first question I ask is, well, make a case. Why are we doing this? Are you doing this because you want to do this, or you think it would be cool? Tell me why it's cool. Why does it fit? I know it feels good, but I need you to be able to say it back to me or write up something, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And I think we have to do that in our profession. If we go and talk in our teams and with other professionals at our workplace and say, oh yeah, we do this, it feels good, it's just the right thing to do, we know it works, it's cool, that doesn't do anything to support that we know what we're doing and that it actually does work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nail on head. Go ahead. Somebody else.
Doesn't that come back to maybe the importance of moving towards a master's degree? 'Cause I think our undergrads don't cover very many theories, so asking them how a theory might apply to program design, I think you'll get a lot of blank stares and blinking eyes, and they just won't know.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you guys both hit it there, that that like multiple levels there of awesomeness of what you guys just said. So if our entry level practitioner degree, whatever that is, whether it's bachelor's level or master's, doesn't get the knowledge about theories, how do we expect people to go out and practice using theories, right? So there are some master's degrees where you get the same 5 classes as what you get at some bachelor's degree granting institutions. So again, not here at Clemson, you get different classes. So you're getting the theoretical discussion, or if you haven't taken Dr. Lewis's class, it will come, or Dr. whoever you guys had. Okay, so you guys should walk out of here when you graduate next year, hint, hint, with some knowledge about theory so that you could go into practice. And when somebody says, okay, develop a new program, you can think, oh, okay, well, what theory fits this? What already, like Sandy said, no need to recreate the wheel. What thought process, what framework already exists to say 1 + 1 = 2? Do this, and do this, and this will be the outcome. Something likely already exists for what you're trying to achieve. You just have to be able to find it and apply it in practice. Okay, Whitney, we're going to come back to you at the end. So I will give you guys an example of how a theory can be used to develop a program. I'm going to go to a whiteboard here. Weird. Shrinking down of my screen here. Text. Okay, so when I was doing my master's degree, I was asked to be the director of this camp called Camp Wild, which was put on by the graduate students in my program. And it was based on self-efficacy. All right, quiz time, pop quiz. What is self-efficacy? Dun, dun, dun. Your willingness to do something. Close. Anybody else want to take a stab at what self-efficacy is? What does self-efficacy mean?
Belief in yourself, like your self-esteem, like your ability to do it, your belief that you can do it. You can push yourself to do it. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes. So it's your ability or belief in your ability to accomplish something, right? So it's very loosely connected to self-esteem and self-confidence, right? They're all really kind of wrapped up with each other. They're 3 distinct things, but they're really closely related, okay? There are 4 sources of self-efficacy, so 4 things that help develop your ability or your belief in your abilities to do something. The first one is verbal persuasion, right? So this means that when people say, good job, or you're so good at doing this, or I really liked how you accomplished that, or I really like how you wrote your name, or whatever, that all of that gives you feedback about your ability, right? So if somebody is saying to you good things all the time, or negative things, you suck, I can't believe you did that, what were you thinking, you know, all those negative things that might, you know, reduce your confidence or your belief in your ability to do something. All right, so verbal persuasion is one way. Overwhelming mastery experiences. Okay, so whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish, we have had successful mastery experiences, right? Not just like little mastery, like, I got a B on my stats test. You didn't just get a B, you got like A+ million, and you got like stars and smiley face stamps on that test too, right? Overwhelming mastery experience, you didn't just excel, you knocked that out of the park, okay? Overwhelming mastery experiences. 3, the third one, I'm missing one and I always, okay, let's see if I can spell this. Physiological responses. Okay, this is kind of like biofeedback, right? When you get nervous about doing something challenging, your palms start to sweat, your heart beats a lot, or your pupils dilate or whatever, okay? So if you are about to do something difficult and you're like hyperventilating and like freaking out type of a thing, you interpret that as something, right? Maybe negatively. Or if you're totally calm, cool, and collected, you interpret that some way as well, right? Like, I got this. I'm cool as a cucumber, right? Okay, hang on. I always forget the fourth one. Oh, vicarious experiences. Okay, so vicarious experiences are where we see somebody similar to us do something and they excel at it, and we say, I'm like her or I'm like him, I can do this too. And so then we go and do it and we try because we know they can do it. If they can do it, I can do it. Okay, so we learn by vicarious experience, and and that contributes to our self-efficacy. Okay, so if we know, because this is what the theory tells us, that these 4 elements here will develop somebody's self-efficacy, wouldn't we try to address these in some way in a program? If our goal is self-efficacy, developing self-efficacy in that program? Well, we should, right? This is the roadmap. This is telling us how to do it. Okay, so this camp that I worked at, I was the director for Camp Wild. It's for kids age like 13 to 17-ish, high school. 13 to 17? 14?
14 to
Okay. 13 to 18-ish, yeah. It was 2 weeks. Well, it was 4 weeks total, 2 weeks for boys camp and 2 weeks for girls camp. And all based on self-efficacy theory and meant to impact their self-efficacy, right? So come to our camp. We'll help, this is how we marketed it to people, will help improve your academic performance, your confidence, your self-esteem. We tried to put it in terms that people understood, because a lot of people hear self-efficacy and they're like, what? I don't know what that is, okay? But there is a ton of research out there that says that self-efficacy can be linked to academic performance. If you can increase somebody's efficacy in one task, it has carryover into other tasks, like at school, okay? So somebody feels like they can excel in mountain biking and that they'll continue to work hard at that. Maybe they'll continue to work hard when, math gets hard in school, and they'll persevere and try to work through whatever obstacles they came from. Okay, so that was the thinking here. Well, let's put together a program. Okay, so we had this summer camp place that we went to up in Idaho, and we set it up all outdoor rec based. Okay, so we had backcountry camping, hiking. We hiked over the Continental Divide and stood on top of the Continental Divide. So we were like half and half in one side of the continent and the other side, the divide. Okay. We had hiking. We had whitewater rafting down the Salmon River. We had mountain biking, and we had rock climbing and rappelling and traversing and everything. So they had like 3 or 4 days in each one of those activities spread out over the course of these 2 weeks. Okay, so verbal persuasion. So how could we address this in a camp setting? Well, as the camp director, I hired all my camp counselors and I trained them all about how to give positive feedback to somebody. And so it's not just about saying, hey, good job, and a pat on the back type of thing. It has to be specific feedback. It can't just be this broad level. Well, what did I do good at? I tied my shoes today. Is that what you're talking about? No, I really liked how you put your hand right here on the rock, because that's going to give you a better hold than if you did this. Or I really liked how you shifted gears going up this one part on that steep part of the mountain there, because you were able to maximize your energy. I don't know, okay? So giving really specific feedback. Okay, that plays into that verbal persuasion. So we spent forever training our staff about how not to just be the high fives, pat on the back type of staff. Okay. Overwhelming mastery experiences. We tried to give them things that were just challenging enough that it would push them to their limit, but we supported them in every way we possibly could by giving them skills and knowledge, and then support, like more than just a high five, but that verbal persuasion. to then push it past that overwhelming, or that up to that overwhelming state, past that bare minimum I did it, to like, holy crap, I did this, like hiking over the Continental Divide, right? You didn't just go on a hike. You went on a 4-day backcountry trip where we hiked over this huge thing. We showed them on a map what it looks like on the Continental Divide. We stood on top of the highest mountain out there, and I have these really cool pictures. And we all did our sign language for Camp Wild, and it was really fun, pictures, blah, blah, blah. And then we had to hike down, and we built our own little shelters. We made fire out of sticks, and we had bear bags and had to do all that stuff, okay? So it wasn't just that they went car camping, right? We did this huge thing, awesome sauce, okay? Well, that was one example. In each one of the 4 activities that we used, we had some level of mastery experience in there so that it would just automatically kind of happen. It seemed like it was like this effortless thing, but it took all this work to figure out how we could make sure that each one of these outdoor experiences had an element of mastery to it. Okay, physiological responses. So this is where we as staff had to be super in touch, in tune, whatever, with all of our little campers, right? So we had to really help them recognize how their bodies were responding to things. So when we were doing rock climbing, and this was not on like a indoor climbing wall, this was on real rocks, and most of these kids had never been climbing on real rocks before, and so we had to teach them how to tie knots, and they were getting nervous, and then they looked at this huge wall that they were going to climb up, and they were freaking out about it, and I can't do this. And so we had to do a lot of, okay, let's stop and think about this right now. Let's take some deep breaths. How are you feeling? Is your heart pounding in your chest? To help them recognize how their bodies respond to things. You can control that. We can always control our responses, right? But if they don't know that, then they just kind of always feel like this anxious state. And then they equate that feeling with certain activities or whatever, and they're never going to feel confident in their ability to do that activity. I always feel like this. I always get sweaty hands and a dry mouth, and that means I'm nervous because I can never actually do it when I feel that way. They might not verbalize that to you, but that's what's like going on in their head and in their heart. Okay, so we tried to help them to recognize how their bodies responded to things. Okay, vicarious experiences. So this is where we tried to identify people who were similar to the kids. So we had some higher level campers who had been there before in previous years, came back as junior counselors. So only 1 or 2 years older than them. They'd done these activities before. They could do and excel in the activities, but they weren't so skilled at these activities that they blew these kids out of the water, right? The new kids. So, man, best example here that we couldn't have planned this, and we didn't plan it, but it just, like, I had tears in my eyes when it happened. We set up a traverse, okay? So we had 2 rock faces that it spanned about 50 feet. So we set up a traverse, like on cliffhanger, where they like pulled themselves out across the rope. And so that's what it was, is pull yourself across the rope, go to the other side, hit the little bell, and then come back across. So we had a cowbell up on the other side. Okay, so we take these boys hiking up there to the top of this traverse, and all these like 17-year-old boys are like, oh, I'm going up there. And as we're hiking up, I could do this. I could totally do this. And we get to the top, and they look over this traverse, and they're all shaking in their boots, and nobody's volunteering to go first, type of a thing. And you could tell that they were all freaking out, these like football player-y types of boys. And we said, okay, who's going to go first? And this, for lack of better description, scrawny little kid, literally like the youngest kid there, the smallest little kid there, big, thick glasses, kind of like all your stereotypical not cool kid things about him. He just waltzes up there, puts on his harness with barely any instruction needed, hooks onto that rope, pulls himself out there across there. He was flying across that thing, hit that bell, and came right back. And I tell you, every single one of those 17-year-old kids was like jaw dropped and was just like pushing each other to get out there to be the next ones to go, kind of like the if he can do it, I can do it type of a thing. But if I had been the one to jump out there, they wouldn't have responded that way, right? Probably because, well, she's the camp director, of course she can do this, And so I wouldn't have instilled in them any type of confidence in their ability by me showing them how to do it. But this little kid who, seemingly didn't have any ability either, but then ended up having ability, showed them all that they could do it too. It was so awesome. Like when we saw that happen, all of us were just like, oh my gosh. You know, and so that night when we were talking about it in the mess hall, we were like, that was so awesome. Okay, and then he was the cool kid from then on, right? Okay, all of this, all 4 of those, every aspect of camp played into these 4 pieces. So then we can measure self-efficacy at the start, have camp happen, all geared towards developing self-efficacy, measure it again at the end, so 2 weeks later, and then some period of time again and again for follow-ups, right? So this theory, this really abstract concept, ended up setting the structure basically for everything in our camp. Maybe not the activities that we chose, but certainly how we facilitated everything happening, right? How we interacted with these kids at camp, how we interacted with each other at camp, all of that. What do you guys think? Yeah? Theory and practice. We got to do it. Using that structure tells us what outcomes to measure, what instruments basically to measure it with. And then doing that enough times then produces enough data, which we could then share, get out there. Is that a randomized controlled trial? Nope. I don't know how we could do that in that type of a setting, but that's better than nothing, right? Theory is at the foundation of everything that we do. It should be at the foundation of everything that we do in terms of research and program design. It's not evidence-based practice if there's no theory associated with it. Dun, dun, dun. All right, any thoughts about theory in practice? It's awesome. Even though you guys might not even fully understand it. That's just one example. There are so many theories out there that tell you how to do things, how to structure things. You just have to find it, which is why we have a class like Into Advanced Theory where you go through 11 billion different theories, right? I know for sure you guys talked about social cognitive theory, of which self-efficacy is a piece, right? Okay. So I think that's going to be the end of our discussion for today. Yeah, and I want to follow up with Whitney. I want to know what's going on at NIH. Are they laughing at you?
So I actually, I texted a couple different people that I know, and then I sent a Facebook message to someone else. So I haven't gotten a response from physical therapy, but I just posted a link to the Occupational Therapy Association's clinical practice guidelines that one of my OT friends shared with me. And she said that one of the challenges with them is that if they're not updated frequently, then they're not of much use. But they do have a really good assortment for adult and child practice. So could be helpful. My friend who's a speech language pathologist said that it would be really helpful to have them and that she wishes that they did.
Just the fact that the OT practice guidelines are online and accessible makes them 10,000 times more usable than our dementia practice guidelines. Yeah.
Well, and I would imagine that a lot of the things covered in theirs are applicable to what we do, just kind of with a different scope on it. So it could be helpful for folks to check out too.
They're what?
It says if you remember, there's 74, like the practice guidelines, but otherwise there are 148.
Yeah,
see, that's not very much. If your facility is willing to buy them, that's not much. Yeah. I'm just clicking on one to see what it says. Okay, so this is OT practice guidelines for Alzheimer's and related neurocognitive disorders. So I just clicked on it and it's got 6 chapters best practice and summaries of evidence, interventions that address occupations. What the heck what is occupational therapy? Occupations in occupational therapy. It's so random. Interventions that address occupations. What does that really mean? I'm sorry. I'm just going to bash on OT really quick. I read that and I think work. Interventions that address work, because occupation, work. What is your occupation? What is your job? I don't know. That's just my totally random aside about OT and the weird use of the word occupation. Interventions that address caregiver strategies, implications of the evidence for occupational therapy practice and research. This is so cool. Children practice, birth through 5 years, mental health promotion, cool for kids. Challenges in sensory processing, sensory integration. Oh, separately, they have one for individuals with autism. Cool. Top 10 recommendations from the OT practice guidelines for adults with stroke. Oh, sign in. Okay. Well, I can't sign in. Very cool. I find this interesting. One of your comments in there that somebody said, so far the response I got was our scope of practice is online. Who was that? Your OT?
So that was my friend who's a speech language pathologist. And then the OT asked if it was like their standards of practice. And so it was having to clarify for people of what I meant when I asked the question, and gave examples of, do you have evidence-based practice to support working with someone who's had a stroke? Like, do you have kind of that black and white outline of what you should be doing for best practice? And then once I kind of narrowed down to what we were really talking about, then I was able to get some information.
Okay, so standards of practice are not practice guidelines. So I have our ATRA standards of practice here.
Yeah.
So I have it online too, but I would have to dig through a bunch of folders to find where I have it. So our standards of practice here are broken down into direct practice.
Yeah.
And then the management of rec therapy practice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But none of this is specific to a population. So this can't be clinical practice guidelines. This more is like, I don't know, this is, okay, so let's look at one of the standards and what it's going to measure here. So in terms of the assessment standard, basically you're putting on here whether it's met or not met. So the assessment process shall be documented within the service's written plan of operation. The process is clear, concise, and has standardized procedures and timeframes for completion. Yes or no? Does your facility have this, yes or no? So this is not specific to your population, your clients, or anything like that. You can still use this, and this is good because it does guide practice to some degree, right? But not specific to a population. So that's funny that they said, like, our standards of practice? Nope, a little bit more specific than that. That's kind of funny. But yeah, you did have to clarify. So interesting. I'd like to hear from other people as we continue in this. This is not like just if you just want to ask around and see what people say. All right. Well, cool. Thank you for doing that. That's cool.
Of course.
All right, go ahead. Does somebody have a question? Oh, of course. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments or anything about practice guidelines or the use of theory in practice? No? Felt like I talked a lot tonight, guys. All right. MOAs tonight, and next week I will be out of town. So we are meeting everybody online. Ooh, we're into October next week. I should be to my hotel and set and good for class Tuesday night. I will check out the Wi-Fi situation, and if it is not awesome, I will email and let you know. But I'm planning to have class because we used up our flex week for Hurricane Irma. Irmagerd.
That was so funny.
That's the funniest thing that I saw spray painted on a board. down in Florida. So we don't have a lot of room. So if we have to cancel because I have crappy Wi-Fi, we'll just have to combine that week with another week and get through a lot of content one night. Okay, but I hope not to do that. I think that's it. Nothing else? Okay, go. Have a good night. Bye. Stop.